Mesechta Peah starts off with a discussion of the halachas regard to planting and produce, which is going to be the discussion in the rest of Seder Zra. And this Mesechta deals with mostly matnas Aniyim. The Torah requires that a person who owns a field to share his produce with those that are less fortunate. When he harvests his field, the farmer or the owner of the field must leave certain matnas Aniyim for the poor. So the first one that we're going to be discussing in this Mesechta is Peah. The pasuk says, when you gather in the harvest of your land, you shall not complete your reaping to the end of your field for the poor, and the convert shall you leave them. Most of this Masechta is going to be discussing Peah, which is the chiyuv to leave a part of one's field unharvested for the Aniyim to collect. Even though the word Peah means end, it's a machlekes Tanoim in the third Mishnah, whether Peah must be left at the end of the field, or if the owner wants to leave it not at the end of the field, if that's okay as well. Midday Raisa, there's no shir la Peah, elu dvarim she'en lehem shir ha-Peah. The first thing mentioned in the Mishnah that doesn't have a shir is Peah. However, Midday Rabbanan, a person has to leave 1/60th of the peiros for the ani. Peah applies to all different types of produce as long as it meets a certain criteria, as is going to be explained in Mishnah Dalet and Hey. It also applies to trees and grapevines, that an owner must leave a part of his orchard just as he does from his field. If a farmer harvested his entire crop without leaving a section for the poor, he must take part of the harvested crop and give it to the poor. Even if he already processed the crop or made flour or bread from the grain, he must give a portion of the processed produce to the poor. Then we have the mitzvah of leket, which is going to be discussed in this Masechta. V'leket ketircha loisa laket la'aniv laget hazev eisam. Leket is stalks that fall while the crop is being harvested. For example, the owner goes to cut the grain he holds the top of the grain and he cuts it with a sickle on the bottom. And while he does this, some stalks might fall to the ground. If one or two stalks fall to the ground, they are leket and must be left for the poor. If three or more stalks fall, they are not leket, and the owner can take them. Leket applies to grains and kidneys, but not like Peah. Leket does not apply to fruit trees. And then we have the mitzvah of shikha. When you gather in the harvest of your field and you forget a bundle in your field, you should not turn back to take it. You should leave it for the ger, the yosem, and the almana, which are all the unfortunate people. There are two types of shikha. The first type of shikha is what it says in the Torah, that if a bundle of produce is forgotten in the field, the owner may not go back to retrieve it. He must leave it there for the poor to collect. This is called shikhas ha'omer, forgotten bundles. But the Chacham learned from here that there's another type of shikha that also you need to leave it as matnas aniyim, and that is if you forgot to harvest and cut some parts of the field, there's a little bit left that you didn't cut. That's called shikhas hakama. Like Peah, shikha applies to all different types of produce, including trees and grapevines. If the owner forgets the bundles of fruit in the field, or he leaves some of the tree he forgot to pluck the fruit's shikha, and it must be left for the poor. If also leket and shikha applies only if one or two bundles were forgotten. If the farmer forgot 3 bundles in the field, they are not shikha. Then we have the mitzvah of peret, which pasuk says, "Uperet karmacha leisalaket la'aniv laget hazev esam." The fallen fruit of your vineyard you shall not gather, for the poor and the convert shall you leave them. In addition to the 3 previous mitzvahs of leket, shikha, and peah, which are all different types of produce for grain, there's a mitzvah of peret, which is for separated grapes. Peret is specifically in the vineyard, and it's very similar to leket. Leket is the individual stalks that fall while the grain is being cut. So peret is the individual grapes that fall from the grape clusters while it's being picked. If 1 or 2 grapes separate from the cluster and fall to the ground, they must be left to the poor. If 3 grapes fall, they are not considered peret. Then we have oilalois. What is oilalois? You shall not pick the underdeveloped shoots in your vineyard. Another gift to be left in the vineyard is oilalois. There are certain clusters of grapes that do not develop normally, and they won't. They won't develop. It's not like that, they're unripe and then they're going to ripen. They're underdeveloped and they will not develop properly. These grapes are to be left on the vine for the poor to collect. Oilalois comes from the lashon of oila, like oil v'yonik, because it's not fully developed compared to an adult. An adult is a developed person, hopefully, and an oila is someone who's not developed yet. The Gemara Chulin and Daf Kuf Amud Aleph says like this: there are 4 mitzvahs of matnas aniyim that apply by the grapevine. You have peah, you have shikha, peret, and oilalois. You have 3 that apply to grain. which is like a shikha and Peah, and trees you have Peah and shikha. What's interesting is that these aren't necessarily matnas aniyim that you go and you give it to the aniyim, but you have to leave your door open, and you have to you have to allow the aniyim to come into your field to take, as the Mishnah discusses towards the end of the Masechta, that the people would come. I mean, throughout the Masechta, there's different ideas mentioned about the people coming in, but it's a lesson for the Baal Habos also to allow people to come in and basically trample over his field. Obviously, he can do things to allow to make sure that not everything gets ruined. But the poor simply come on their own and take as much as they can, and the farmer may not interfere. However, he does designate certain times for the poor to come. If the owner takes these matnasim for himself, he must give it to the poor an equal amount of what he took. All the matnasim you do not need to take off trumas ha'maisros. A poor person who takes his matnas aniyim is not required to separate any meiser from it. Even if the poor person later gives it to a rich person, he doesn't need to take off meiser. And there is no kedusha to them. He may eat them at any time, in any place. And even though it's only specifically for poor people, but there is a Mishnah, there is a Shita that a person could go, a rich person, a person who owns more than what an ani owns, can go and be mafker everything that he owns and become poor, and even a regular poor person could give it to a rich person if they want. It's something else besides for these matnas aniyim that we previously mentioned. There's also a mitzvah called Meiser Ani. The Meiser Ani is separated and given to the poor during the 3rd and the 6th year of a 7 Shemitah cycle. Unlike the other matnas aniyim, which are left in the field and the poor, the aniyim come take it by themselves, Meiser Ani is separated from the produce after the harvest is over, and the owner distributes it to the poor. Like the other, and similar to the other matnas aniyim, Meiser Ani has no kedusha and may be eaten anywhere. It's interesting though that even though we're not going to be discussing so much hilchos maisros, but throughout the Masechta and Bichlal is the introduction to the Zroim part of Seder Zroim, we're going to mention a lot of different concepts about Meiser. So any fruit that grows in Eretz Yisrael is going to be subject to a lot of different halachas. The first is Truma, which is the Midah Beinanis, is the 50th of the crop, which is given to the Kohen. After separating Truma, the owner separates Meiser Rishon, 1/10 of what's left, and he gives it to a Levi. The owner then separates 1/10 of what remains in the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th year of the 7-year Shemitah cycle. This 10th is Meiser Sheni, which the owner takes up to Yerushalayim and eats it there. During the 3rd and 6th year of the cycle, that's Meiser Ani, as we mentioned. The 7th year is Shemitah, when no crops may be planted. Whatever grows on its own during Shemitah is exempt from all Meiser. Until all these portions have been separated, the produce may not be eaten. The Iker Chumra is Tevel, which is a very strong Midaraisa. Meiser, we know from Masechta D'mai that people weren't always so careful to take off Meiser, but Truma, even the Amaratzim, even the people that aren't so careful, they would take off Meiser. And with this ends our introduction to Masechta Peah.